September 24th, 1945. Camp Huntsville, Walker County, Texas. The train slowed before dawn, and the man who will carry this story stepped down with about 180 other Japanese prisoners, eyes narrowed against the light and the unfamiliar scent of pine. He had been a private first class in the Imperial Japanese Army, captured on Saipan in late June 1944, when the last organized positions crumbled above the beach at Tanapag. For more than a year, he had moved across the map like a piece of freight, from a holding cage on Guam to a fenced compound on Oahu, and then by ship to San Francisco, and by rail over the long interior distances of the United States. He had learned the rhythm of guard commands in English. He had learned the sound of whistles in American rail yards at night. He had learned that the food issued at the big way stations came in regular portions and was not cut down without warning. At Huntsville, the air felt heavy and warm even in September. Through the open door of the Pullman car, he had glimpsed the camp before he entered it. A grid of wood barracks with light poles and wires, a hospital building with a brick chimney, a water tower with a fresh coat of paint. He stood in line and did not speak. He gave his name and service number again. He watched a clerk work an ink pad and stamp, watched a camera flash, watched a medic record his temperature and ask about old wounds. He still expected tricks. He still expected the sudden snap of humiliation. Years of training had built a picture of captivity as a slow, gray death. He had prepared himself for it on Saipan when he pressed his body into coral dust and listened to the final explosions rolling inland like thunder. Yet as he walked between two white lines chalked on the ground toward his assigned barrack, he noticed the neatness of the camp and the way the fence posts stood straight, the wire tight and clear of rust. He caught a smell he could not place at first, and then knew it must be meat fat from a cookhouse range burning low. He carried that smell with him through the doorway and into the bunk aisle where each bed was numbered and each mattress was clean. He sat and looked at his hands until the bell sounded for morning roll call. Across the Pacific and across the American interior, the movements that brought him to this place can be counted. The United States held 425,171 Axis prisoners in the country in May 1945. Of that number, 371,683 were German, 50,273 were Italian, and 3,115 were Japanese. Texas was a major part of the network. It held 7 base camps and scores of branch camps that supplied labor to farms, sawmills, and canneries across the state. The big camps included Brady and McCulloch County, Hearn and Robertson County, Hereford and Deaf Smith County, Huntsville and Walker County, McLean and Gray County, Mexia in Limestone County, and a coastal site at Wallace near Galveston. Japanese prisoners in Texas were a small fraction compared to German and Italian prisoners, yet the record shows hundreds present at any one time. Hearn had a few hundred by wartime counts. Kennedy housed several hundred more in 1945. Huntsville, the camp that opened in 1943 to hold Germans, transferred its German population in September 1945 in order to receive Japanese prisoners who had been selected for a re-education program that would continue into 1946. The prisoner who stepped off the train into the pine-scented dawn belonged to that group. He did not know the curriculum then. He did not know the names of the American professors from the nearby college who would later move among the barracks with simple textbooks, English readers, and copies of the United States Constitution for classroom work. He did not know that the government counted the project as the only program of its kind for Japanese prisoners on American soil, and that the number of participants would remain in the low hundreds. What he did know came from what he had seen and heard since capture. On Saipan, he had listened for the last order to die, had listened for the guidance that never came. In Oahu, he had watched American medics work on a man torn by shrapnel without asking anything in return, had watched a chaplain read to a dying prisoner from a book he did not understand. On the ship to San Francisco, he had learned the scale of the American supply chain from the leftovers in bins at the end of each meal. White bread ends, meat trimmings, coffee poured out when the urn went cold. He learned that these were not performances for the enemy. The numbers behind the scenes ran outward like roads from a central point. He became one of the points at the far end of those roads. The first morning at Huntsville began with details so precise that they overruled speculation. He received his ration in a mess line that moved without delay: scrambled eggs, grits, bread, and coffee with milk. He tasted each item separately, as if it might change in the mouth the way sea rations had changed, when water held the taste of rust. He sat at a long table and listened to the talk in his own language, from men who had crossed different parts of the Pacific, under different flags, and in different years. One had been picked up as a sailor near Kwajalein. One had walked out of a cave on Tinian after the last grenades had gone off in the dark. Several had been pulled from small boats along reef lines where they had tried to hide among floating leaves of sargassum. The man from Kwajalein said he had lost count of days before the patrol found him, and then he paused and added a number anyway, because numbers made memory easier to carry. The barracks leader, appointed by the camp sergeant, but chosen from among the prisoners for steadiness, explained the schedule for the week. Work details would go out by truck to rice fields and orchards and cotton rows in Walker County and in adjoining counties if needed. The man at the center of this account felt his stomach tighten at the word fields. Work on farms in the United States did not fit anything he understood. He knew American farms from pamphlets used as training aids back in Manchukuo that praised American tractors but called American farming weak in spirit. He had seen a different kind of farm when the transport rolled across the flatlands west of the Mississippi and south toward the Gulf. He had seen fields that met the horizon in straight lines and grain elevators that rose beside tracks like new hills poured out of concrete. His own experience of farm work from his early years ran toward small plots terraced against hills, boys bent in rows with hand tools, women lifting water from a channel with a swing pole, neighbors working together under a spring sky and keeping count of favors. The American pattern looked like something built by a surveyor with a long chain and a book of rules. He did not know how a man fit into that pattern without breaking, and he kept that question to himself. When the trucks finally came and the guard at the tailgate counted 12 men up, he climbed with the rest and grabbed the slat on the sideboard. He tried to hold his mind in a safe place while the pine trees slid past and the road turned off the highway onto a lane marked by a mailbox with a family name in black paint. The truck stopped near a barn that smelled of cattle and hay. The guard spoke to the farmer, and the farmer nodded and took off his hat for a moment, in the kind of gesture that reads as respect in any language. The farmer pointed to a stand of trees where shade reached the edge of a fence. A long table waited there with a cloth on it, and a metal drum stood beside a brick pit. The smell on the morning air lifted again and widened. Meat cooked somewhere beyond the corner of the barn. The farmer's wife came up with a younger woman and set out plates while the guard reviewed the rules about distance and tools and time. A boy ran out to stare and hung back when his mother looked over. The guard finished, and the work began. The prisoner bent to cotton with a short hoe and worked a length of row, quiet in the heat, pushing the blade in and out with the pace he had kept as a teenager when the harvest needed him. When the noon bell rang from the back porch, the farmer said something to the guard who waved his hand with a practiced motion, and the line of men walked back to the shade. The drum lid lifted with a sigh, and the first sweep of smoke came out. He had never seen a steel drum turned into a cooker. The farmer slid racks forward with a hook to release a smell that made the eyes water. The men froze because they had never seen enemies treated this way. The farmer said something in a slow voice, and the guard repeated the words in Japanese. The women had cooked for everyone, and there would be enough. The line formed and stopped and started again with small steps. He took his plate without saying anything and stood with it for a long moment, as if an officer might walk out from behind the barn and knock the plate to the ground just to teach a lesson. No one moved to stop him. He sat with the others, set the plate on his knee, and tasted smoked beef for the first time under a Texas sky. His eyes filled before he could stop them. He covered his face with his hand and waited for the shaking to pass. He did not have a word that covered what it felt like when duty and memory and hunger and shame and sudden kindness all moved at once like a storm line blowing across a field and then through the body. He ate slowly because he wanted to prove to himself that the food would not be taken away. The record is clear about the background of scenes like this one. Texas farmers and ranchers used prisoner labor widely from 1943 through 1945 as local workers left for military service and as the wartime demand for food and cotton climbed. County agents and growers filed requests with camp administrators for crews to pick fruits and nuts, cut and shock grain, thin and hoe cotton, and load vegetables bound for canneries. The state's 7 base camps, with more than 70 branch camps under their administration, sent trucks outward each morning to meet the tasks. German prisoners made up the great majority of the workers. Italians were visible in some parts of the state during the 1944 season. Japanese prisoners were few by comparison, and were usually kept in more secure compounds with heavier guard force. But even so, the surviving photographs and county reports show that small Japanese details went to fields in a handful of counties in 1945 and 1946. Huntsville's story has another layer. In September 1945, the War Department shifted the camp's mission to a small program that tested whether classroom lectures, news films, and carefully selected reading could help Japanese prisoners think about politics and civic life after the war. The transfer lists show roughly 150 to 200 men arriving for that purpose. The camp closed in early January 1946 after most of those men went to West Coast ports and then by ship to Japan. Within the larger national picture, the Japanese presence in the continental United States remained very small. The peak number of Japanese prisoners held anywhere inside the country in the spring of 1945 fell under 4,000. By contrast, tens of thousands remained on Oahu, Kauai, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, and in the Philippines at work sites where the United States military used their labor to dismantle bases, clear fields, and prepare equipment for shipment home. The climate of feeling also matters. The Pacific War had been fought with unusual ferocity on both sides. Allied reports described Japanese treatment of captured Americans and Commonwealth troops in terms that older civilians still repeat with careful, heavy breath. American historian John W. Dower and others have written about racial images that hardened during the fighting. Against that background, the appearance of a plate set down for a Japanese prisoner at a Texas farm table is not a small thing. It is a detail that forces scale into the open. A war that had sent aircraft groups of hundreds across ocean spaces now reached down into a tree line at the edge of a field, where a woman with a ladle poured beans into a bowl held by a man who until recently had carried a rifle for the other side. Numbers add further context. A single county in the Brazos Valley could report thousands of prisoner workdays in one harvest season. A single cannery could pack tens of thousands of cases of tomatoes with prisoner labor in July and August, when the fields came in all at once. A single cotton gin consumed so much electric power in October that the local utility had to stagger machine hours and run lines hot through the night. Scale speaks first in totals, then in ordinary acts. The barbecue at a farm outside Huntsville sits inside that larger pattern as one more example of how the system ran. He returned to the camp that evening with the smell of smoke in his clothes and a calm he did not trust. At lights out, he lay awake with his hands folded on his chest and traced a path through the past year. He set the story down in order, because that is the only way to make sense of a fall that felt instantaneous while it was happening. He had been pressed into a reserve trench on Saipan on June 28, 1944, with scrap ammunition and a field bottle still half full. He had watched a man beside him open his last grenade and pull the pin with his teeth, and then look up at the sky the way a man looks up before he bows. He had watched American artillery correct by 50 meters, and then by 25, and then hit the mark. He had carried a runner back to an aid station and had understood only then that there were no stretchers left and no sedatives left, and that the officer in charge had already written out the final words for the unit history that would never be filed. On the shoreline, he had crawled into a shallow scrape and waited for darkness, then had walked out with his hands raised when the patrol lights found him. He had repeated the stories he had been told since childhood about honor and death, and chosen silence rather than argue with himself. In Oahu, he had made a first line in a notebook issued by the camp that asked for a daily record. He had written that he felt shame like a fever, and then had stopped writing that word because he could not make it smaller by using it again. He had copied a sentence about his health on the next page instead. On the ship to California, he had stood on deck under guard and watched the harbor grow on the horizon like a wall of towers and cranes, and had understood for the first time how many ships an enemy can build when the factory belts do not stop even at night. In the train that rolled east, he had learned the shape of the interior. He had watched the planes and the grain elevators and the stacks of lumber and the rows of cars in factory lots, hundreds shining under, lamps set on poles that lit a yard as bright as morning. At Huntsville, he had lined up for a physical and been told that he would attend classes in addition to work details. He had nodded because men nod at instructions even when they do not agree. On the farm, he had been fed meat that had been cooked for hours over coals, meat that fell apart in strands when he lifted it with the edge of a fork. He had held a slice of white bread in his left hand and balanced the fork in his right. Two small acts that carried a weight out of proportion to their size. He had not fainted or shouted or tried to run. He had eaten in silence like the others. Back in the barracks, he carried images to sleep that he had no words for. He let the images run in a slow reel until he drifted off. The documentary record gives examples that help place his feelings in a wider frame. The first Japanese prisoner taken by the United States was Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, captured on December 8, 1941, after his midget submarine grounded off Oahu. His remarks after the war, preserved in print, describe a shame that filled the chest and the desire for death that followed capture in those early hours. Military indoctrination and peer pressure turned surrender into a disgrace that reached into a man's family life back home. The number of Japanese soldiers who allowed themselves to be taken alive in the field remained very low through 1943 and 1944. On Saipan, more than 10,000 Japanese troops died in battle, while the number taken alive was measured in the low thousands. On Iwo Jima, the numbers ran even lower. In New Guinea and the Philippines, the pattern held with small variations. When Allied forces did take prisoners, they placed them in collection points near beaches or airstrips and moved them quickly to rear areas. Many of those men never saw the continental United States. They worked instead at base salvage, runway clearance, or depot details in the islands. The men who did reach the mainland usually came for interrogation and analysis work run by the War Department and by the Office of the Provost Marshal General. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and a smaller site in Iowa handled much of that flow. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945 and shipping eased, the government moved a few hundred Japanese prisoners into Texas as it rebalanced camp populations for return voyages to the Pacific. The Huntsville re-education program began then with a small intake and a short calendar. Classes were recorded with start and end dates and with the names of American instructors. The goals read plainly on paper. The program sought to encourage a basic understanding of representative government, of civic responsibility, and of the separation of powers. Newspapers arrived at the camp in bundles. A bulletin board carried summaries of proceedings in Tokyo after the announcement of surrender on August 15, 1945, and of the formal ceremonies held on September 2, 1945, aboard the American battleship in Tokyo Bay. Inside that frame, life in the Texas camps continued to move with a harvest rhythm. September meant rice cutting along the river bottoms. October meant cotton ginning and sorghum. November meant cane syrup, pecans, and sweet potatoes. Work crews moved through those tasks in tens and hundreds, and then returned to barracks where evening roll calls counted heads against morning lists. When local families offered food at field edges or at barn lots, they did so within rules set by the camp. Guards stayed close. Distances remained marked in paint. Yet the food itself crossed a line that orders and signs could not fully maintain. What the prisoner at the center of our account felt under the pines was recorded by others in different words and at different times. The surprise at receiving good food without charge. The pain of realizing that the old image of the enemy no longer stands up against the weight of daily evidence. The confusion at being treated as a human being by people who had reason to hate. The mix of relief and grief that can make a man cry without noise into the crook of his arm. This is the shape of the moment that opens the rest of the story. The second morning after arrival began with cloud cover that dulled the light over the pine hills around Camp Huntsville. The prisoners formed up for roll call at 6 o'clock, their ranks smaller than before because several work crews had already gone out toward the Brazos River bottom for the cotton harvest. The man whose steps we follow stood in the fourth row, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the barbed wire. The guard's voice moved down the line, reading numbers. When his number came, he answered without pause, his tone flat but clear. The discipline drilled into him since training on Kyushu still ruled every gesture, yet something behind his eyes had changed. During the night, he had dreamed of the barbecue under the trees, of the sound of the American boy laughing as smoke rose from the drum, and he woke with the taste of salt still on his tongue that was not from sweat. He folded the image away before the whistle blew. The men marched to the mess hall and ate the same measured breakfast: bread, grits, sausage, and black coffee. He had learned to drink it now, to swallow the bitterness without flinching. At 7, a truck took them north toward the Trinity River Plain, where fields rolled out in long, ordered bands. The farmer who met them wore overalls and a cap printed with a seed company logo. He shook the guard's hand and said something that drew a small smile. Then he pointed to a stand of tall corn ready for cutting. The prisoners spread out, scythes in hand, the air full of the dry hiss of blades. The man worked in rhythm, sweat darkening his shirt, the sun pushing through the cloud. At noon, as before, the farmer's wife called them to rest, and again the sight of food waiting in open air stopped him. This time the dishes were corn, beans, and biscuits. The pattern was clear now. The farmer said the same words about sharing because the day was hot and there was plenty. The guard nodded again. The man ate slowly, his muscles trembling with fatigue, but his mind sharper than it had been in months. He began to study the movements of the people who had fed him. He noted how the wife poured drinks, how the farmer kept the work simple, how the boy brought a bucket of water for the guards first, and then another for the prisoners. There was a structure in this, too, a kind of discipline that was different from command chains or punishments. It was the order of confidence. From above, seen through the lens of official records, these days form part of the closing movements of a vast system. In 1945, more than 511 main prisoner-of-war camps operated within the United States, though many were already emptying after Germany's surrender in May. By September, Washington directed that remaining manpower be used to bring in crops before demobilization of the Guard forces began. The labor output that month reached a recorded peak of more than 25 million man-hours nationwide, an amount equivalent to roughly 100,000 full-time farm workers. Japanese prisoners were too few to alter totals, yet the sight of them on southern fields drew local attention. Newspaper columns in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana described them as quiet, industrious, polite, phrases copied from inspection reports. American civilians often came to see them out of curiosity. In some counties, church groups arranged visits to show hospitality, part of what officials called the good neighbor policy, aimed at influencing attitudes before repatriation. Behind that phrase stood a careful plan drawn in Washington. The War Department and the Office of the Provost Marshal General viewed humane treatment not only as compliance with the Geneva Convention, but as an instrument of post-war policy. The government expected these prisoners to become witnesses when they returned home, proof that American power rested on material abundance and moral restraint. The number of Japanese prisoners who would actually speak about that later is small, but not zero. Reports gathered by occupation authorities in Japan between 1946 and 1948 record repeated remarks about plentiful food, fair guards, and machines that never stopped. In a sense, the American countryside itself became a classroom that no textbook could match. Inside Camp Huntsville, the educational program advanced quietly. The prisoners called it simply the school. Each weekday afternoon after labor detail, they sat in a wooden hall where a chalkboard had been mounted against one wall. American instructors from Sam Houston State Teachers College walked from town under guard, carrying slim folders of English lessons and civic readings. The man we follow sat near the back at first, listening but taking no notes. He understood only fragments, words like freedom, to rights, people, repeated in slow English and then in the clipped Japanese of a translator. On the third day, the instructor wrote on the board, "Government by the consent of the governed." The translator searched for a phrase that would not lose the meaning. The prisoner watched the chalk break and fall to the floor and felt a strange pull in his chest. In his country, government had been a distant mountain and duty had meant obedience. The idea that authority required agreement from those below, it felt almost childish. Yet the tone of the class was calm, not mocking. He copied the sentence into his notebook. Later that evening, back in the barracks, he looked again at the words by lantern light and wondered how such a rule could function among millions. The guard who made rounds paused at the door, and seeing the notebook, nodded once. Small gestures like that carried disproportionate weight in a place where every movement had been watched for months. Outside the camp fence, the Texas night stretched wide and quiet, broken only by the hum of transformers feeding electric light to farms miles away. He stared through the wire until his eyes blurred, and thought of the blackout streets of Osaka and Tokyo as they had been described to him by men captured later in the war. The contrast felt impossible, yet it existed just beyond the fence. The war's end had changed the rhythm of everything around him. In August 1945, when Japan accepted surrender terms, news reached the American camps by radio first, then by official notice. For Japanese prisoners, the announcement arrived like a blow that struck even deeper than capture itself. Many refused to believe it. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, a few dozen men rioted, shouting that the report was false and that Tokyo still stood. At Camp Huntsville, there was only silence. The prisoner sat on his bunk and listened to the interpreter reading the statement in slow Japanese. The words felt empty at first. Days later, when newspapers with photographs of Tokyo under occupation reached the camp, disbelief began to fade. Letters from home were still forbidden, but rumor filled the space instead. Someone said that cities had been burned to ash. Someone said that an entire garrison on an island near Kyushu had vanished in a single flash of light. No one used the word atom yet. In class, the American instructor did not speak of it. He continued with lessons about elections, local councils, and newspapers. The prisoner began to raise his hand during question periods, asking what happened if people disagreed with the government, if soldiers refused to fight, if a leader failed. The interpreter tried to answer, though sometimes the concepts lacked exact equivalence in Japanese. He found that he looked forward to the classes now, not out of belief but curiosity. He wanted to know how a country that could destroy cities also made room for disagreement without collapsing. On Sundays, he was allowed to walk to the camp library. There he found an English reader for foreign students and a small volume of Lincoln's speeches printed in both languages. He did not understand all the words, but he copied a line into his notebook. With malice toward none, with charity for all. He read it twice and wondered how men who had fought a war could speak that way afterward. Late in October, the farmer who had hosted the first barbecue sent a message to the camp through the guard company. He planned another meal to mark the end of the picking season and asked if the same work crew might attend. Permission came through after inspection. On the morning of the 28th, the trucks rolled again down the dirt road bordered by yellowing weeds. The men worked until midday, filling wagons with the last of the cotton. When the whistle blew, smoke already drifted from the grove near the barn. This time the scene was larger. Several families from neighboring farms, 2 guards without helmets, and a table laid out with trays of food. The prisoner stood at the edge of the group, uncertain. The farmer's wife motioned for him to come forward. He did so, feeling the rough ground under his bare feet through the thin soles of the issued shoes. Someone turned on a portable radio playing music from Houston. The boy from before handed out paper plates and smiled without fear. The prisoner took his portion, a piece of grilled chicken and a biscuit, and sat on the grass. Around him, conversation rose and fell. He heard laughter that did not sound forced. He realized that in this moment he was not being watched as an enemy, but as a man holding a plate of food under the open sky. His throat tightened again, and he looked down, pretending to wipe sweat from his eyes. He thought of home, of his mother's garden, of the sound of cicadas in summer. He thought of the officer on Saipan who had ordered them never to surrender and of the men who had obeyed. He ate slowly, each bite heavy with memory. The documentary view widens here to the scale of post-war transition. Between September 1945 and the end of 1946, the United States repatriated more than 500,000 Axis prisoners from the continental camps, shipping them through New York, Norfolk, and San Francisco. Japanese prisoners sailed mostly from San Francisco and Seattle in batches of several hundred per voyage. Records show that 3,009 Japanese POWs left American ports by March 1946. Many passed through Huntsville's re-education program first. Each received a medical check, new clothing, and a final pay voucher for work performed during captivity, usually less than $20. They boarded trains westward through the same plains they had crossed eastward months before, then ships bearing names like General Black and General Stewart. Some wrote brief notes of thanks in careful English before departure. A few left behind small carvings made from scrap wood, gifts to guards or camp staff. When the ship carrying our central figure left port in late December, he stood on deck again, this time looking east toward the falling light over California. He carried with him the notebook filled with copied phrases and one folded photograph of the farm family who had served him food. He could not explain why he kept it, only that it proved something about the world he had entered. The ocean stretched out in steady blue lines. Somewhere beyond that line lay a homeland he no longer recognized. The ship that carried him home reached Yokohama in March 1946, part of the third major repatriation convoy from San Francisco. When the coast came into view, mist still covered the ruins, and the cranes at the port looked like bent metal ribs against a gray sky. He leaned on the rail and tried to recognize the shoreline, but there were few landmarks left. He had expected the return to feel like waking from a nightmare. Instead, it felt like stepping into one that had been waiting for him. On the dock, women and children in patched clothing waited in lines for returning soldiers, their faces a mix of relief and fear. The American military police directed disembarkation in silence, notebooks in hand. Each man passed through a medical check and a registration desk, where he gave his name and old service number once more. When his turn came, he spoke clearly and waited for the clerk to finish writing. Then he looked at the final form stamped "Discharged Prisoner of War" and realized that for the first time in his adult life, he did not belong to any army or system. He walked through the gate into a city that smelled of ashes and wet wood. Whole districts of Yokohama had burned in the raids of 1945. The ground was scattered with brick dust and melted glass. He took a train toward his family's home in Fukuoka Prefecture, the same train line he had ridden 6 years before as a recruit. Now the carriages were packed with refugees, soldiers, and children clutching small bundles. Outside the window, fields that once grew rice lay unplanted, dotted with blackened stumps where houses had stood. He carried his one bag and the notebook from Huntsville and tried to imagine where to begin again. The nation around him was a ledger of loss. Official surveys by the Ministry of Home Affairs in spring 1946 counted over 2.7 million Japanese dead from the war, including 1.74 million soldiers and sailors, 300,000 civilians killed in air raids, and nearly 800,000 missing. Of the 6.6 million Japanese who had served in the military, about 3.5 million returned home after surrender, most in the same condition as he was. Disoriented, malnourished, uncertain where they fit in the shattered social order. Tokyo had lost 50% of its buildings. Osaka and Nagoya lay in comparable ruin. The cities reeked of smoke and sewage because the utilities had not yet been restored. In the countryside, inflation had eroded the yen, and farmers often traded rice directly for goods rather than using cash. In this landscape, the man found that even survival felt like trespassing on the past. He reached his family village after 2 days of travel and found the house standing but scarred. His mother's hair had gone white. His younger brother, too young for the draft, worked the small field behind the house with a borrowed ox. The sight of home should have brought peace, but it only deepened the confusion that had begun in Texas. He looked at the tools, the buckets, the old wooden plow, and thought of the American farms where tractors moved under electric light, and the work never stopped for want of machines. He tried to explain what he had seen, but the words failed. His mother listened without judgment, her eyes hollow from the years of rationing. That night, when the house fell quiet, he opened his notebook and read the sentence he had copied from Lincoln. "With malice toward none, with charity for all." He read it aloud softly. The words felt foreign but also necessary, like medicine for a wound that refused to close. In the months that followed, he learned that many former prisoners carried similar experiences back into Japan. American occupation authorities, under General Douglas MacArthur's supreme commander for the Allied powers, SCAP, collected statements from returnees as part of their effort to gauge public opinion. Among the 3,000 men repatriated from the continental United States, the majority reported humane treatment and ample food. Some expressed admiration for the efficiency of American agriculture and industry. A few, especially those from Huntsville and Kuskia camps, described their education classes and English lessons. The information fed directly into SCAP's strategy for reconstructing Japanese society along democratic lines. American advisors understood that the testimony of former POWs could help undermine militarist nostalgia and promote acceptance of reform. At the same time, the Japanese government's Ministry of Welfare established repatriation centers to process the returning millions. There, doctors treated malnutrition and tuberculosis, while social workers asked questions about political attitudes. It was an immense logistical effort. Between October 1945 and December 1946, over 5 million Japanese nationals returned from overseas territories, colonies, and battlefields. Ships arrived daily at Maizuru, Hakata, and Uraga, unloading men who had lived through Burma, New Guinea, Manchuria, or like him, the American mainland. Each brought fragments of experience that together began to rewrite how the nation thought of defeat. The prisoner found work in the summer of 1946 with a local agricultural cooperative established under occupation reform. The American-led Ministry of Agriculture encouraged such cooperatives to replace the old landlord system. He hauled sacks of rice, repaired dikes, and filled out forms printed in bilingual Japanese-English text. His literacy and patience made him useful. The foreman soon learned that he could translate some English words, and he became the informal interpreter whenever American officers visited. He felt uneasy speaking for others, but he could not refuse. Once, during an inspection of the fields, an American lieutenant asked through an interpreter what the workers needed most. The man hesitated, then answered in halting English, "We need machines and peace." The officer nodded and wrote something in a notebook. Later that year, tractors began arriving through the government aid and relief program, old models from Kansas and Illinois refitted for Japanese farms. When he saw one rolling through the village road, smoke rising from its exhaust, he thought again of the Texas farm and the endless straight fields beyond the horizon. It seemed that the world he had glimpsed through the wire fence had already started to remake the one he lived in. The larger historical frame confirms this transformation. Between 1946 and 1949, under SCAP supervision, Japan enacted land reform that transferred ownership of nearly 38% of all cultivated land from absentee landlords to tenant farmers. In material terms, it was the most significant redistribution in the nation's history. Productivity rose sharply. At the same time, American engineers and Japanese planners rebuilt transportation, electricity, and steel production. By 1949, Japan's industrial output had doubled from the low point of 1946. Behind these numbers lay countless exchanges like those that had begun in Texas, moments when former enemies discovered mutual dependence rather than hatred. In official reports, occupation authorities cited the attitudinal change among repatriated POWs as a supporting factor in social stability. Many of those men, having witnessed America firsthand, became informal teachers in their communities, explaining not propaganda, but simple facts. That Americans worked hard, that food was plentiful, that freedom did not mean disorder. The man in this story never used the word teacher for himself, but when children from the village asked what America was like, he told them about wide roads, about lights that stayed on all night, and about people who shared food without asking questions. Each time, his voice softened on the last detail, as if he still needed to believe it fully. He woke before the bell and listened to the quiet of his mother's house, a quiet that felt thinner than the silence in the barracks at Huntsville. In Texas, the night had hummed with distant lines and transformers and with the small noises of a camp that never fully slept. In Fukuoka, in the spring of 1947, the night air sat still, with only the faint sound of a cart on a dirt road and the drip of water from a broken gutter. He rose and went to the field with his brother and set his feet into the mud of the paddy with the same care he had used when he first stepped into the cotton rows outside Huntsville. He had learned not to hurry at the start of a day. He moved in measured strokes, learning again the weight of a hoe that had been made by a village blacksmith rather than by a factory that stamped numbers into steel. By mid-morning, he had fallen into the rhythm of work and memory that carried him through most days now. He would bend to the plant, lift his head, and see not the hills behind the village but the long level of Walker County and a table under pines where a woman set down a plate and nodded for him to take it. The shock of that afternoon did not fade. It had begun like a jolt along the spine that took the air away. It had settled into a steady warmth that he did not fully trust, but could not deny. On a Sunday, he took the notebook from Huntsville and walked to the small schoolhouse where an American officer and a Japanese interpreter spoke about the new election that had been held in April of the previous year. The officer used simple words, and the interpreter explained again what consent meant in civic life. The villagers listened from benches and from the doorway. When the officer asked if anyone had questions, the prisoner held his notebook in both hands and asked whether a man who had been a soldier could vote just like anyone else. The officer answered that every adult had the same standing now. The interpreter used a word that meant equal under law. He walked home in a light rain with the word repeating in his mind. That evening, he helped his mother add rice to a thin soup and then sat by the doorway while the light faded from the yard. He opened the notebook and tried to write a letter in careful characters to the farm family in Texas. He did not know if the letter would ever pass through official channels. He did not know if the family would still be at the same mailbox on the same road. He wrote anyway. He thanked them for food when food had carried more than flavor. He thanked them for looking at him as a man. When he tried to finish the letter, his hand shook and the line of ink broke. He set the brush aside and covered his eyes with his palm until the heat passed. He folded the paper and placed it inside the notebook and told himself he would carry it to the repatriation office in town and ask whether the Red Cross could forward it to the camp. The map around him showed a country writing a new set of rules while it tried to feed itself. In 1946, the calorie intake for many urban families had fallen near 1,600 calories a day. The black market in Tokyo and Osaka grew because ration lines moved slowly and often ran dry. American occupation authorities responded with emergency shipments of grain and powdered milk through programs managed by the Army and by relief agencies. The tonnage figures rose by the month through 1946 and 1947. At the same time, the political plan moved ahead at a pace that would have seemed impossible before surrender. The new Constitution of Japan was promulgated on November 3, 1946, the date chosen to honor culture and learning, and it came into effect on May 3, 1947. The text placed sovereignty in the people and set out protections for speech, assembly, and religion. It also contained the famous renunciation of war in Article 9, a sentence that sounded simple and absolute in a country whose last years had been consumed by armies. Elections held in April 1946 had already produced the first House of Representatives under the occupation. Voter turnout reached high numbers that surprised foreign reporters who walked through the crowds outside polling places. Land reform accelerated, even as ballots were counted. By the end of 1947, more than 1 million tenant households had received title to fields they had long farmed for landlords. In material terms, that meant a different relationship to work, to tools, and to harvest decisions. In emotional terms, it meant that men like the former prisoner could stand in a field and feel that they belonged to it in a way they never had before. Industry began to stir as rail lines were cleared and boilers relit. The Industrial Production Index that had fallen to a fraction of the pre-war level in 1946 began to climb. By late 1948, it had reached a little over half of the average of 1934 to 1936. Electricity generation rose with it. Steel that had been measured in small monthly totals now ran in millions of tons per year again by the end of the decade. The numbers did not erase loss. They marked a path forward that could be walked one step at a time by people who had nothing to spare. The occupation authorities watched the numbers and also watched the tone in village meetings and in city streets. Reports sent up to Tokyo mentioned the steadying influence of former prisoners who spoke quietly about what they had seen in America. The numbers in those reports were small, but the words carried weight because they were not delivered by officials but by neighbors. In the summer of 1947, the cooperative where he worked received a small instruction manual translated from English about seed selection, spacing, and soil drainage. The pamphlet had crude diagrams, but the advice was clear. He read it line by line, then walked the dikes and looked at the flow of water through the paddies with new attention. He asked the foreman for permission to test a different spacing on one corner field. The foreman shrugged and said he could try. That season, the rice from the corner field ripened evenly, and the heads stood firm in a wind that bent the other rows. It was not a large thing, but it was a proof he could hold in his hands. At the end of the harvest, the cooperative organized a small meal for all the workers. There were fish grilled over charcoal, a pot of rice, and a little sake brought out by the elders. He found himself near the fire with a cup in his hand and the steady heat on his face. Someone asked him again about America, not about industry this time, but about families. He spoke about the boy at the farm near Huntsville who had handed plates without fear, about the way the farmer had looked at the guard and the prisoners with the same steady gaze, about the sound of a portable radio playing songs from a station in Houston. As he spoke, he felt the same knot rise in his throat that had taken him by surprise under the pines. He stopped and looked down at his shoes. A neighbor placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing. After a moment, the knot loosened, and he continued in a lower voice. He said that the meal had shown him something that a book could not. He said that strength can look like a quiet table and enough food for everyone rather than like a shouted order. He looked up and saw that the men around the fire had their eyes on the coals. The memory of food had moved across an ocean and through a year and still held its shape. The next day he carried the letter he had written to town and asked at the office whether it could be sent to the United States. The clerk read it and nodded and told him it would go through the Red Cross chain and might take months or might never arrive. He bowed and thanked the clerk anyway, because the act of sending the letter mattered even without a reply. He walked home with the empty envelope in his pocket and felt lighter. The broader picture in those years held events that could crush any private feeling if a person stared at them too long. The Tokyo trial, formerly the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, opened in May 1946 and continued for more than 2 years. 28 defendants were tried on counts that ranged from planning aggressive war to responsibility for atrocities committed across Asia. The record of the trial ran to thousands of pages. The verdicts came in November 1948. 7 men were sentenced to death and were executed in December. Others received long prison terms. Newspapers printed summaries, and radios carried brief bulletins. In villages and towns, the news traveled by word of mouth as well. Some people reacted with anger. Some reacted with relief. Many reacted with a tired acceptance that matched the state of the country. Educational reform moved at the same time. The old system that had sent children through a ladder of strict schools gave way to a plan built on 6 years of elementary school, 3 of lower secondary, and 3 of upper secondary, with new subject matter and new books. Women gained full legal rights, and the elections of 1946 had already seated the first group of women in the National Assembly. The occupation forces reduced censorship, allowed new magazines to print essays and fiction, and encouraged labor unions to form, which they did in the hundreds. The daily facts of life also changed. By 1947, electric power reached villages that had never seen steady light at night. By 1948, factories in Osaka and Nagoya began to run more than one shift again, and ships that had been idle returned to service along the coast and across to Korea and China with relief goods and raw materials. Within that frame, the return of a few thousand Japanese, who had been fed by American farmers in Texas, might seem small. It was not small. When a man who had worn a uniform and carried a rifle explained to a room of neighbors that he had been invited to sit and eat by an American family without insult or bargain, the story passed from that room into others. It traveled because it asked little and claimed less. It offered a scene that any listener could imagine: a table under trees, a cooked meal in common. The quiet that follows a first taste when the mind checks for trickery and finds none. The record shows that German prisoners in the United States kept up correspondence with American families for decades. Japanese prisoners left behind fewer letters, but there were some. The archive contains small notes with simple phrases and careful characters that thank a guard for fairness or a farmer for rice and meat on a hot day. There is no need to turn those notes into a theory. It is enough to say that they exist and that they reflect a truth that folds into the statistics of production and reform. The man in this story never received a reply to the letter he sent, at least not in the months that followed. He continued to work the fields and to attend the village meetings, and to read the small volume of speeches he had carried back from Huntsville. On May 3, 1947, the day the new Constitution came into effect, the village school held a brief ceremony with a flag and a reading from the preamble. He stood at the edge of the crowd and listened as the teacher read the words that said authority came from the people. He thought of the chalk breaking on the board in Texas and of the guard who had nodded when he saw a prisoner copying a sentence into a notebook. He closed his eyes and saw again the drum lid lift and the smoke roll out, and he felt the same humility and the same ache that had filled his chest then. The ache was not shame any longer. It was something quieter and more useful, a wish to be worthy of the kindness he had been shown by strangers in another country at the end of a terrible war.